Lieutenant Commander Mark Reynolds slammed his hand on the briefing table and pointed directly at Sergeant Sarah Blake in front of the entire team. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice cutting like wire. "You're not a sniper. You're a political assignment wearing a patch you didn't earn." The room went dead silent. Every man stared. Sarah didn't flinch, didn't blink. She just looked at him and said quietly, almost gently, "Then let the bullet decide, sir." Reynolds laughed. He actually laughed. That laugh would haunt him for the rest of his life. If this story already has your attention, hit that subscribe button right now and follow every part to the end, because what happens next in those mountains will shake you to your core. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The wind off the Kunar River Valley was the kind of cold that didn't ask permission. It came through the seams of your jacket, through the collar of your gear, right down into the place where your confidence lived, and tried to kill it slowly. Sergeant Sarah Blake had learned to stop fighting that cold a long time ago. You didn't fight the mountain. You read it. You breathed with it. You let it tell you what it was going to do before it did it. She was lying flat on her stomach on a ridgeline that had no name on any official map. Her cheek pressed against the stock of her M110 SAS rifle, her left eye open, her right eye closed, and her entire body so still that a man standing 6 feet away might have mistaken her for part of the ground itself. Below her in the valley, SEAL Team 7 was dying by inches. Not all at once, not in some dramatic explosion that would make the headline. Just slowly, methodically, the way real combat actually worked. One pinned position, one blocked avenue, one wrong piece of intelligence that had sent 11 men into a convoy escort route that the enemy had been watching for 3 days. The convoy was 4 vehicles, 2 MRAPs, 1 supply truck, 1 communications van. All of them had stopped moving 18 minutes ago when the first burst of AK fire had come down from the western ridgeline. Since then, the convoy had been static, which in a mountain ambush was the same thing as being a target painted on the ground and lit up with a floodlight. Sarah had counted the muzzle flashes. She had mapped the firing positions in her head before anyone else had even figured out which direction the shots were coming from. 3 primary positions, 1 elevated cave mouth at approximately 430 meters bearing 270, 1 secondary position behind a natural rock shelf at 380 bearing 265, and 1 that was the real problem, a 2-man RPG team that had set up in a depression just below the cave mouth, shielded on 3 sides, which meant that conventional suppression, fire from the convoy's angle, was physically incapable of reaching them without a perfect elevation differential, which Sarah had, which nobody was asking her to use. Blake. The voice in her earpiece was Lieutenant Commander Reynolds, and even through the radio static, she could hear the particular tension in it, the clipped, controlled sound of a man who was angry and scared and refusing to be either. "Blake, I need you to confirm your position." "Confirmed, sir. I'm at the secondary overwatch point. I have eyes on 3 hostile positions." "Good. Stay there. We're going to work the suppression from the convoy's angle." She kept her voice level. "Sir, with respect, the RPG team in the depression cannot be reached from the convoy's angle. The angle of elevation doesn't—" "Blake, 1 word, hard as a wall." "Sir." "I said stay there." She went quiet. She kept her eye on the scope. Below her, she could see one of the SEALs. She would later learn it was Corporal Rodriguez, pressed behind the wheel well of the lead MRAP, his rifle up firing suppression rounds that were hitting nothing more threatening than the rock face above the cave mouth. Good shooting, wrong geometry. Sergeant Derek Sullivan was on the opposite side of the vehicle trying to move forward toward better cover, and every time he moved, another burst of fire came down from the western shelf and pushed him back. He'd made the same attempt 4 times now. He was going to make it a 5th, and the 5th time he was going to get hit because the pattern was completely readable from up here, and Sarah was watching it develop like a problem written out on a chalkboard. She pressed her radio. "Commander, the RPG team is setting up for a shot on the lead vehicle. I'm reading the positioning and the angle of their body language. They're going to fire within the next 40 to 60 seconds. Static, then roger that. Convoy is already aware. We're working it." "You're not working it," she thought. "You're hoping it goes away." She exhaled slowly, breathed in, let her heartbeat settle into the rhythm she had trained herself to find, not the fast, anxious pulse of someone waiting for permission, but the long, slow drumbeat of someone who had already made a calculation and was simply waiting for the correct moment to act on it. The RPG man shifted his weight. His partner lifted the tube. Commander. She kept her voice so calm it was almost a whisper. I have the shot. Right now. I need clearance in the next 15 seconds. Nothing. 10 seconds. Commander, they're about to fire. I need your answer. And then in the earpiece, she heard something that turned her blood to ice. Not Reynolds' voice. Not a command. Not even static. She heard Petty Officer First Class Carlos Mendez, who was on the convoy's internal radio channel, say clearly and without a trace of irony, "Don't sweat it. The female's up there. She'll figure out something with her feelings." Laughter. Actual laughter. 3 men minimum. Sarah closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. 1 second was all she allowed herself. Then she opened them and put her crosshair on the RPG operator's center mass. She didn't fire. Not yet. She wouldn't fire without clearance. That was the rule, and she was not going to break it because some men in her earpiece thought her presence was a comedy routine. But she would be ready. Let the shot decide, she said very quietly into the radio. Nobody responded. She wasn't sure if anyone had even heard it. It didn't matter. What mattered was the next 4 seconds. The RPG operator raised the tube to firing position. His partner braced. She could see the exact moment of commitment in the way the man's shoulders dropped and squared, the physical language of someone who has made the decision to pull a trigger. And then Reynolds' voice, tight and fast. Blake, take it. She had already taken the breath. She fired. The round traveled 431 meters. It found the RPG operator at the base of his throat, and he dropped without a sound, and the tube dropped with him, and the partner scrambled backward in pure animal panic and exposed himself from behind the depression wall, and before he had taken 2 full steps, Sarah had worked the bolt acquired him and fired again. He went down. The cave mouth position, suddenly panicked by the loss of their most dangerous element, opened up in undisciplined spray fire that went wide and high, exactly what panicked gunmen do when they don't know where the threat is coming from. Rodriguez used the break-in pattern to finally move forward. Sullivan got up. Both men got to better cover in the time it took the cave position to understand that their angle was no longer safe. 40 seconds later, Reynolds had reorganized the convoy's fire. The secondary rock shelf position was suppressed and then eliminated by a grenade launcher. The cave mouth position, now firing blind and wild, was reduced by coordinated fire from 3 SEALs working in a proper spread. The ambush collapsed. It collapsed because the RPG team never got their shot. The RPG team never got their shot because of a bullet fired from a ridgeline with no official name by a soldier that 11 men had spent 3 weeks telling wasn't a real sniper. The convoy began moving again 7 minutes later. Sarah remained on the ridgeline until full clearance was called. Protocol. You stayed in Overwatch until the principal element was clear. So she stayed, and she watched the vehicles move through the valley below, and she felt nothing dramatic. No surge of vindication, no heat of anger released. She felt what she almost always felt after a shot, a quiet, functional assessment. Was the geometry correct? Yes. Was there a better option? She had missed no. Were the results consistent with the calculation? Yes. She got up, slung her rifle, started the climb down. The climb took 20 minutes. By the time she reached the staging area where the convoy had pulled up and the team was doing a post-contact accountability check, the mood among the men was the particular combination of high adrenaline and performative calm that follows a firefight that you survived. Men were checking gear, reloading, checking on each other with the kind of rough physical contact, a slap on the shoulder, a grip on the arm that was how soldiers said, "I'm glad you're alive," without ever using those words. She walked past 3 of them. Got nothing. Wasn't expecting anything. Petty Officer Mendez saw her coming and said loud enough for 4 men to hear, "Hey, look, feelings worked." 2 of them laughed. She kept walking. She found a spot near the rear vehicle, checked her rifle, did her own accountability of rounds expended, and was writing in her range log when she heard footsteps stop next to her. She looked up. Reynolds. He was a tall man, 6'2" or 6'3", with the particular physical density of someone who had spent 20 years being tested by things that would have ended lesser people. His face was the kind of face that didn't give things away for free. You had to earn a read on Reynolds. Most people never got there. He stood next to her for a long moment without speaking. She waited. "Good shooting," he said finally. The words came out like he was reading them from a card he didn't believe in. "Thank you, sir." He looked at her for another beat. She could see him working something out behind his eyes, some calculation he hadn't finished yet, some equation that her existence in this unit kept disrupting. "You fired before I called it," he said. "No, sir. You called it with approximately 1.5 seconds to spare before the RPG team committed to the shot. I said to stand by. You said take it, sir. Those were your exact words. I have the radio log if you'd like to review it." Something moved across his face. Not quite anger, something more complicated. "Next time you're this close to acting without clearance," he said, "you come to me first. You don't make solo calls on this team." "I didn't make a solo call, sir. I made 17 requests for clearance in the 38 seconds before the window closed. The radio logs will confirm that as well." He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze without aggression, without apology, without the slightest tremor of the need to be liked or believed. She simply looked at him the way she looked at a problem, clearly, steadily, without pretending it was something it wasn't. He turned and walked away without another word. Behind him, she heard Mendez say something low to Sullivan, and Sullivan said something back, and both of them laughed. Sarah turned back to her range log. She wrote 2 hostiles neutralized, RPG engagement prevented, convoy mobile. Rounds expended 2 of 2. She paused. Then she added one more line, not in the official log, but in the small personal notebook she had carried since Kandahar, since the day that had started all of this. "No one waits for the perfect moment. You create it or you lose it." She had written that line for the first time 3 years ago, in a different country over a different kind of loss. She had written it then because she needed something to hold on to when everything else had been taken from her. She wrote it again now, not because she needed the reminder, but because it was still true. It was always still true. Daniel had been dead for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. She knew the number the way you know the combination to a lock that holds something irreplaceable. Not because you want to remember it, because forgetting it would be a different kind of betrayal than the one that already lived in you. Staff Sergeant Daniel Cole had been her closest friend since her second deployment, when they were both assigned to a Kandahar FOB, doing what the official records called combat support operations, and what actually meant going out every day into places where people wanted to kill you and trying to make sure they failed. Daniel was not a complicated person. That was the thing about him that people who hadn't known him sometimes misunderstood when she tried to explain it. They assumed simple meant unremarkable. It didn't. Daniel was simple the way a compass is simple, completely reliable, always oriented toward the right direction, valuable beyond calculation precisely because of the clarity of his function. He laughed too loud. He ate whatever was in front of him without complaint. He had a photograph of his daughter taped to the inside of his helmet, which he called the most important piece of tactical equipment I carry. He was 31 years old. He was 31 years old, and then he was not anything at all. The mission was a routine extraction. That was what made it the thing she could not stop thinking about even now, 3 years later. Lying on ridge lines and in staging areas and in the half-sleep of operational deployment. It was routine. The kind of thing you do 200 times and stop thinking about because the repetition has sanded the edges of your attention smooth. The designated marksman that day was new. Not unqualified, officially certified, range-tested, check in the box. But new in the way that matters in a real environment, which is different from the way that matters on a controlled range where the wind is documented and the targets don't move and nobody is shooting back. A single insurgent with a PKM had set up behind a low wall at the edge of the compound they were extracting from. The marksman had the shot. He had time to take it. He missed by what the incident report later estimated as 18 inches. The PKM opened up. Daniel was the first man in the exposed lane. He was the only one who died, which in one way was the closest thing to a mercy the situation offered, and in another way was the kind of mathematics that doesn't make grief smaller, it just makes it lonelier. The incident report said, environmental factors and target movement contributed to the missed engagement. Sarah had read that report 4 times. She had read it 4 times because she was trying to find the place in it where the truth was, and what she found instead was the place where the language had been carefully arranged to avoid the truth, which was simpler and harsher. Someone had not prepared enough for the conditions they found themselves in, and Daniel had paid the cost of that gap. She was not angry at the marksman. She had been briefly in the first weeks. Then she had moved past anger into something colder and more useful understanding. If you didn't understand what killed someone, you couldn't prevent it from killing someone else. And preventing it from killing someone else was the only thing she could offer Daniel now. So she started learning. She had no formal sniper training. Requests to attend the school had been denied twice, once because of operational needs at current assignment, and once because of reasons that were never formally stated, but that every woman in uniform understood without needing them spelled out. So she found the knowledge other ways. She found former snipers who were willing to talk, retired mostly. Some of them, the kind of retired that means they've traded the field for a classroom and are quietly relieved about it. She read every technical manual she could access. She read ballistics texts that were not written for military consumption, but for competitive long-range shooting, because competition shooters often understood the physics of a bullet's flight with a precision that purely tactical training didn't always develop. She learned wind physics not as a diagram on a slide, but as a living system of variables that she could feel and read and predict. She learned elevation as a mathematical truth, not an approximation. She studied every documented account of failed sniper engagements she could find, the misses, the near misses, the shots that had come 1 second too late, and she built in her mind a map of every way that the gap between preparation and reality could open up and swallow someone. It took 2 years. At the end of those 2 years, she applied for sniper certification through a third Channel 1 that required a formal performance evaluation rather than a school slot. She submitted her evaluation request with a target score that was 40 points above the minimum certification threshold. She hit 52 points above it. The certification board had been confused by her. She could see it in the way they looked at her file, then at her, then back at the file, as if one of these things must be wrong. They certified her anyway. The numbers left them no alternative. She was assigned to SEAL Team 7 6 months later, which was not a normal assignment. Path, a woman attached to a SEAL team in a direct support role, was still unusual enough that the word political had followed her transfer paperwork the way a smell follows its source. She had heard the word before she ever walked into the team room. She had heard it again every week since. Reynolds had said it to her directly 2 weeks into the assignment, in a conversation that he probably thought was a private evaluation, but that every man in the team room had heard through the paper-thin operational privacy of a forward deployed unit. Your assignment here is a political decision made by people who are not the ones taking the risk. I want you to understand that I'm aware of that, and I will be watching your performance accordingly. She had said, "Understood, sir." She had not said, "I have spent 2 years training for a failure that your team is still capable of repeating." She had not said, "The only political decision I'm concerned with is the one that gets made when someone doesn't have Overwatch and needs it." She had not said any of it because she had learned the hard way that words in these rooms landed differently depending on who was saying them, and that the most powerful argument she had was not a statement but a result. Let the bullet decide. She had thought it for the first time in that conversation with Reynolds. She had said it out loud today, almost by accident, and Reynolds had heard it and still hadn't understood it. Not yet. She finished her strange log, closed the notebook, looked out at the valley where the convoy was now fully mobile and moving away from the contact point, and the mountain was just a mountain again, and the light was changing in the way it changed at this altitude in late afternoon, going from pale gold to a sharper, thinner quality that made everything look like it had been cut out of something harder than it actually was. Somewhere behind her, Mendez was telling someone about the contact, and she caught her own name in the telling, delivered with a particular vocal inflection that turned any word into a joke if the speaker had decided that was the category it belonged in. She didn't turn around. She was already thinking about the next shot. Not a specific shot, not a specific target. She didn't know yet what the next operation would require. But she was thinking about the preparation, the endless, recursive, never quite finished work of understanding every variable that stood between a bullet leaving a barrel and a bullet arriving at the place it was meant to be. Because Daniel had waited for the right moment, and the right moment had not come, and the marksman who was supposed to create it had not been ready enough to do that. And so Daniel had died in a routine extraction that was supposed to be so ordinary it barely warranted the word mission. She was not going to be the person who was not ready enough. She was not going to be the reason someone's daughter didn't get to see her father come home. She was going to be the reason the shot happened every single time, in every condition, at every distance, in every wind, regardless of what the men around her had decided to believe about her. One bullet at a time. That was the only argument that had ever mattered, and she was just getting started. 40 meters away, Reynolds stood with his back to her, watching the convoy's dust trail settle in the valley below, and he was holding something in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't respect, he wouldn't have called it that. It wasn't quite doubt about his own judgment either, because Reynolds was not a man who arrived at self-doubt quickly or without resistance. It was something more like the feeling you get when you've been reading a map and suddenly realize you've been holding it upside down. Not the moment of understanding yet, just the first sensation that something isn't matching up the way you expected it to. He didn't know what to do with it, so he did what he always did. He turned back to the mission. He checked on his men. He radioed forward to the base element and gave his contact report with the precise, uncolored language of a professional. He did not look back at the woman sitting behind the rear vehicle writing in her notebook. But he didn't stop thinking about the shot either. 431 meters, no preparation time, 60-second window, 2 targets, 0 misses. The math didn't care who did it. That was the part he was still working on. 3 days after the convoy ambush, the team was back at the forward operating base, and the silence between Sarah Blake and SEAL Team 7 had taken on a new texture. It wasn't the same silence as before. Before, the silence had been simple dismissal, the kind of quiet that says, "You don't exist in any way that matters to us." Now it was something more complicated. Now it was the silence of men who had seen something they hadn't expected and hadn't yet decided what to do with what they'd seen. Petty Officer Mendez was the first one to test the new boundaries. He did it the way he did most things, sideways, with a joke wrapped around the real intent, so you couldn't call it what it was without looking like you had no sense of humor. He walked past her table in the chow hall where she was eating alone and reading a ballistics manual, and he stopped and looked at the book and said, "Feelings in physics. Must be a real page-turner." 2 men behind him laughed. Sarah didn't look up from the page. "Terminal ballistics chapter is particularly good. I can dog-ear it for you if you're interested in understanding what happened to that RPG team." Silence. Not the laughing kind. Mendez opened his mouth, closed it, and kept walking. Sullivan, who had been one of the 2 men laughing, found somewhere else to be very quickly. She turned the page. What she didn't show them, what she had never shown any of them, was the part that came before the stillness. The part that happened at night in the 4 to 6 a.m. window when the base was at its quietest and her mind was at its loudest. When she would lie in her cot and go back through every shot, every decision, every variable, and find the places where things could have gone differently. Not because they had gone wrong, because she needed to know every way they could have. That was the practice nobody saw. The replay, the reconstruction, the relentless grinding work of turning one successful engagement into a permanent piece of knowledge rather than a lucky outcome. She had started doing it after Kandahar, after Daniel. She did it every single night. And on the nights when the replay took her back too far past the shots, past the training, past the certification boards, and the rejected applications, and the 2 years of self-directed study that nobody had sanctioned or acknowledged on those nights, she would arrive at a memory that was not about shooting at all. She would arrive at a particular morning in Kandahar 18 months before Daniel died, when he had found her sitting outside the motor pool at 0500 with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a look on her face that he, being Daniel, had immediately read without being asked to. He had sat down next to her, taken the cold coffee out of her hand, replaced it with his own hot cup and said, "Talk." She had said, "I'm fine." He had said, "Sarah, talk." And she had talked about the rejection, the second one, the one that had used the phrase operational fit considerations in the official language and meant something completely different in the language that everyone actually spoke. She had talked about the particular kind of tired that comes not from the work, but from the resistance to the work, from spending twice the energy, proving you deserve to be in the room, that other people spend actually doing the work inside the room. Daniel had listened to all of it without interrupting, which was one of the things about him that she had never taken for granted, because most people listening to something difficult are actually just waiting for the moment they get to respond. He had waited until she was completely done. Then he had said, "You know what the problem is?" "The problem," she said, "is approximately 40 years of institutional." "No," he said. "The problem is that you're trying to win an argument. You can't win an argument with a system." The system doesn't listen. You want to change something, you make the system irrelevant. You become so undeniably necessary that the argument stops being worth having. She had stared at him. That's easy to say. I know it is, he said. I also know it's the only thing that's true. She had thought about that conversation for the rest of that deployment. She had thought about it during the certification evaluation when the board was staring at her file with expressions that suggested they were solving a problem they hadn't anticipated. She had thought about it the day she walked into SEAL Team 7's team room and saw 12 faces rearrange themselves into versions of the same expression Reynolds had worn in the briefing. The look that said, "We already know what you are, and what you are is not what we need." She had thought about it today in the chow hall when she turned the page on her ballistics manual and didn't look up at Mendez. Becomes so undeniably necessary that the argument stops being worth having. She wasn't there yet. She knew that. One shot, even a perfect shot in a high-pressure window, was not undeniable. One shot was to people who needed it to be lucky. She had heard the word twice since the convoy. Once from Mendez, once from a PO2 named Harris, who had said it in a conversation he probably hadn't realized she was close enough to hear. Lucky, freak result, not a pattern. She closed the manual, picked up her tray, walked out. Reynolds watched her leave from the other side of the room. He had been watching her off and on for the past 3 days, with the particular attentiveness of a man who doesn't want to be caught looking. He had the report from the convoy contact on the table in front of him. He had read it 3 times. He had written his after-action notes twice, which he never did. He was a first draft man by nature and discipline. But something about the contact report kept resisting the clean summary he was trying to put on it. He had written Overwatch element performed effectively during contact. He had looked at that sentence for a long time. Performed effectively was the language you use for equipment that did what it was rated to do. It was not the language for what had actually happened, which was that a single shooter with no preparation time and a closing window had removed the most dangerous element from a 3-position ambush before it could fire, and had done it with 2 rounds, no misses on moving targets in mountain wind at over 400 meters. Reynolds had been in the teams for 21 years. He had worked with some of the finest designated marksmen in the U.S. military. He knew what a legitimate shot looked like, and he knew what luck looked like, and the cold truth that he was sitting with in the chow hall watching Blake carry her tray out the door was that what he had witnessed was not luck, which meant he had been wrong. And being wrong in a way that could have gotten his men killed was the particular kind of wrong that Reynolds did not know how to carry lightly. He picked up the report, wrote a new line. Overwatch element demonstrated decisive marksmanship capability under time-critical conditions. Assessment of effectiveness requires extended observation. He put the report down. Extended observation. It was the most he could offer right now. He was a fair man. He believed that about himself, but fair didn't mean fast, and he had built an assessment of Sarah Blake in the first week that was not easy to dismantle in 3 days. He needed more data. That was the honest version of where he was. What he didn't tell himself, what he was not yet ready to tell himself, was that the resistance wasn't really about data. It was about what it would mean if she was right. If she was right, then the way he had read the situation from the beginning was wrong. And if that was wrong, then the question of what else he had been wrong about, not just about her, but about the assumptions that had produced his reading of her, was a question he wasn't prepared to answer yet. So he didn't. He told himself he needed more data, and he waited. He did not have to wait long. 6 days after the convoy contact, the intelligence package for the next operation came in, and everything changed. The mission was a covert SEAL insertion into a canyon complex approximately 40 kilometers north of their current position. The objective was a Taliban logistics hub. Weapons storage communications equipment. A mid-level commander named Khalil, who had been moving material through the canyon network for 2 years and had survived 3 previous attempts to interdict him because he understood the terrain better than the people looking for him. The intelligence assessment rated the target location as lightly defended. 1 fixed position at the canyon entrance, 2 or 3 roving guards, no evidence of crew-served weapons. Reynolds read the assessment. He had a feeling about it that he had learned over 21 years not to ignore a low-grade specific unease that lived in the place behind his sternum and spoke in the language of pattern recognition rather than explicit thought. He had been to places rated lightly defended before. He knew what that phrase cost when the rating was wrong. He brought the package to the team, walked them through the objective, the approach route, the extraction plan, assigned positions, designated Sarah Blake as Overwatch. Her position was a secondary elevation point above the canyon entrance, far enough from the primary insertion to maintain tactical separation close enough to support if needed. Questions, he said at the end. Mendez raised his hand, which was itself unusual. Mendez rarely raised his hand, he just spoke. The fact that he raised it meant he wanted what he was about to say to be on the record. Are we sure we want the attachment on Overwatch for a primary element insertion? Reynolds looked at him. She's not the attachment anymore. She's the Overwatch. Mendez processed this, nodded once, said nothing else. Sarah, sitting at the far end of the table, wrote something in her notebook. She didn't look up, didn't react, but under the table her left hand closed briefly into a fist and then opened again. Not joy, not vindication. Something more complicated, the feeling of a door opening into a room you'd been told didn't exist, and not knowing yet whether the room was what you'd needed or something else entirely. She wrote Overwatch, primary insertion support, and then below it the one thing she always wrote before every operation: know the distance before you choose the position. The distance is never just physical. Daniel had said that to her once in a completely different context. He had been talking about relationships, specifically about the way she kept everyone at a particular remove that felt like professionalism but was actually armor. She had laughed at the time and told him he was not as insightful as he thought he was. She thought about it differently now. The pre-operation window was 36 hours. Sarah used all of it. She pulled every available piece of information about the canyon, complex satellite imagery, terrain analysis reports, previous patrol observations, any photographic documentation from the 3 prior interdiction attempts. She built in her mind a 3-dimensional map of the canyon that was more complete than the official intelligence package, not because she had better sources, but because she was looking for different things. The official package was looking for guards and weapons storage. She was looking for geometry, elevation differentials, shadow patterns at different times of day, the specific way mountain terrain created and destroyed wind lanes at the canyon floor versus the rim versus the intermediate elevations. She found something in the 3rd previous patrol observation, a report from 14 months ago that had been filed by a Marine infantry patrol that had entered the canyon from the south approach and pulled back when they encountered resistance. The patrol report included a brief mention of elevated firing positions observed in cave structures on the western canyon wall. The report rated these as not currently manned and had filed the observation in the environmental notes section rather than the threat assessment section. She read that sentence 4 times. Then she went to Reynolds. He was in the operations center working through communications protocols with the team's radio operator. She waited until there was a natural break, then said, "Sir, I need 2 minutes." He looked at her. "Talk." The canyon's western wall has documented cave structures that were used as elevated firing positions 14 months ago. The current intelligence package doesn't flag them as active threats. I think that's an error. He was quiet for a moment. The assessment rates the location as lightly defended. Yes, sir. The assessment is based on drone observation of the canyon entrance and the logistics hub. The western cave structures are in a dead angle from the primary drone approach path. They wouldn't be visible in the current imagery. Reynolds looked at her, then at the imagery on the table, then back at her. You're saying the drone missed a defensive layer. I'm saying the drone couldn't have seen it from the approach angle used, which means we don't actually know if those positions are manned or not. He was quiet for 10 seconds. She counted. She had learned to let Reynolds have his 10 seconds. He was a man who processed things fully before he spoke, and cutting into that process made him close up rather than open. "What do you need?" he said finally. "I need permission to adjust my Overwatch position. The secondary elevation point in the current plan puts me behind the canyon rim, which is a good angle on the entrance, but a bad angle on the western wall. If I move 200 meters east along the rim, I can see both. That puts you 800 meters from the primary element." "Yes, sir. Wind and elevation are workable at that distance. I've run the numbers." Another pause. "You're confident about this?" It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. "I'm confident about the geometry. I'm not confident about what's in those caves. That's the point. I'd rather find out from 800 meters than have your team find out from the canyon floor." Reynolds looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that wasn't hostility and wasn't trust yet either, but was something in between a man holding a new piece of information against everything he already believed and checking the fit. Approved, he said. You'll have comms check at H-2. You don't move without my confirm. Understood, sir. She turned to leave. Blake, she stopped. If you're wrong about the caves, you're 800 meters from anyone who can support you. She turned back just enough to look at him over her shoulder. If I'm wrong about the caves, sir, the problem is an empty canyon and nothing happens. If you're wrong about the caves, the problem is your team in a kill zone. She paused. I'd rather own the first kind of wrong. She walked out before he could respond. Behind her, Reynolds stood in the operations center and looked at the satellite imagery and thought about 14-month-old patrol reports and drone approach angles. He picked up the imagery package, put it down, picked it up again. He had been in the teams for 21 years. He had survived but trusting his instincts and verifying his assumptions. He had just been presented with a case where his current assumptions might have a gap in them, identified by the last person in the unit he had expected to identify it. He put the imagery down for the last time. He went back to communications protocols, but he pulled the canyon overwatch position on the planning map and moved the marker 200 meters east. 14 hours later, in the pre-dawn darkness, SEAL Team 7 began their approach into the canyon complex. Sarah had been in position for 90 minutes before the team entered the canyon. 90 minutes of stillness, of reading the air, of watching the canyon in the particular quality of pre-dawn light that was not quite dark and not quite dawn, when shapes had edges but not yet details. She had set up her position with the precision of someone who treats every piece of ground as a contract. You take what the terrain offers and you give it your absolute attention in return. Her radio crackled. Reynolds calm, precise. Overwatch primary element is at the canyon entry. Confirm your status. Overwatch is set, all clear on the entrance. Western wall is dark. No movement. Roger. Primary element is moving. She tracked them through her scope as they moved. 11 men moving with the controlled low-profile discipline of people who had done this so many times that competence had become physical reflex. They moved in a column, spread correctly angles, covered the particular efficiency of a highly trained unit that knew how to move without looking like it was moving. They were 200 meters into the canyon when Sarah saw it. Not movement. Not yet. Something subtler, a change in the quality of the darkness in the highest cave mouth on the western wall. A shadow that was not the same shape it had been 60 seconds ago. Her heartbeat didn't change. Her breathing didn't change. Everything in her went to the calculation instantly and automatically, the way her body had learned to operate like a system switching from standby to active without the pause of human hesitation. Commander, her voice was completely flat. I have a shape change in the primary cave structure. Western wall top position. I can't confirm a person yet, but the shadow geometry has shifted in the last 60 seconds. A beat. Then Reynolds' quiet copy. Team holds. The team stopped moving. Silence in the canyon. Then from the second cave, not the first, the second, the one below, and to the left, a muzzle flash. Everything happened at once. The shot from the cave went wide, the shooter not yet calibrated for the team's position in the canyon, but the intention was immediately and completely clear. And so was the response, Reynolds' voice sharp and controlled. Contact western wall, 2 positions, take cover. And the team fractured into movement men. Going to the limited cover the canyon floor offered, and above them the cave positions were activating not 1 or 2, but at least 4, lighting up in sequence with the particular choreography of a prepared ambush position that had been waiting for exactly this. Sarah had already picked her first target. She didn't wait for the word. Reynolds gave it anyway. Overwatch, you're clear to engage. She fired. The first shot hit the primary cave's RPG operator at 812 meters. She knew the distance to the centimeter because she had calculated it 4 hours ago and refined it twice since then. She worked the bolt, acquired the secondary cave, fired. The shooter there had come fully into the opening to get a better angle on the team below, which was the mistake she had been waiting for. 2 shots, 2 targets, elapsed time 4.3 seconds. But there were more. There were more because the intelligence had been wrong in the way that she had suspected it might be wrong. And now the canyon floor was a geometry problem that her team was trapped inside. Reynolds' voice, I've got at least 3 more positions. Blake, I need the third cave from the top right side. Working it. She was already on it. The problem was angle. The third cave on the right side had a natural overhang that shielded the interior from her current position. She needed to shift 18 inches to her left to break the angle. She shifted. The movement took 1 second. The shot took 2. Third cave right side is clear, she said. Copy. I've got 2 men down, non-fatal need, that fourth position, top of the run. She found it. The shooter there was moving, not panicked, trained, working across the cave mouth in a pattern designed to prevent targeting. She tracked the pattern for 2 cycles, predicted the third, fired at the point in space where the pattern said he would be. He was there. Fourth position neutralized. Below her in the canyon, the firefight was shifting. With 4 of the cave positions gone, the remaining enemy elements were losing their coordinated elevation advantage, and the SEALs were adapting, moving to angles that gave them better returns. She could hear it in the radio traffic, the shift from defensive to aggressive, the language of men who had been losing and had suddenly found the equation changing in their direction. Reynolds, Blake, there's a 5th position. I can't see it. Where is it? Stand by. She swept the western wall methodically, looking not for movement, but for the absence of movement, the place that was being deliberately still in a moment when everything else was chaos. Because whoever was running the 5th position was trained, and trained shooters went still when the targets were looking for them. She found the stillness. It was behind a rock shelf 40 meters below the primary cave, and it was a 2-man team with what she assessed as an RPG plane. The cylindrical profile of the launcher was barely visible at the edge of the shelf, and it was oriented directly at the team's primary cover position. 5th position is 40 meters below primary cave western wall rock shelf. 2-man RPG team. They're set up for a direct shot at your primary cover. You need to move your left element right now, sir. How long do I have? 10 seconds. Maybe less. Moving, and then his voice no longer in her ear, but in the canyon below. Left element move. Right. Move now. Go. She heard the scramble of bodies moving across rock. She put her crosshair on the RPG tube. She didn't try to hit the operator. She tried to hit the tube. At 800 meters in mountain wind against a target the width of a man's fist, that was not a shot that was supposed to be possible. She fired anyway. The tube disappeared from the shelf. 2 seconds later, the RPG detonated behind the rock shelf, the round cooking off from the impact the explosion contained within the natural rock structure, a flash and a concussive thump that rolled up the canyon wall and reached her position as a pressure wave she felt more than heard. The 5th position was gone. The canyon went from firefight to aftermath in about 90 seconds after that. The remaining enemy elements, having lost their elevated advantage and their RPG capability, and the coordinated timing that made the ambush a kill zone rather than just a difficult fight, made the rational decision and broke contact. The SEALs pushed forward, cleared the logistics hub, found the weapons cache, and took the communications equipment. Khalil wasn't there. He had moved 3 days before, which was intelligence failure number 2 for the operation, but that was a problem for later and for other people. What was present and accounted for was all 11 members of SEAL Team 7, 2 of them with non-fatal wounds, that would heal, none of them with the kind of wound that doesn't. Sarah stayed in position until Reynolds called the all clear. Then she disassembled her position, packed her kit, and began the walk back to the extraction point. 40 minutes. Dark, rocky ground. She did it in silence because it was the kind of work that required the full attention of your body and your mind, and because she had learned that the time between action and debrief was the time when she did her best processing of what had just happened. What had just happened was the intelligence had been wrong. The canyon had been a kill zone. The team had walked in, and because of a 14-month-old patrol observation that a Marine infantry unit had filed in the wrong section of a report, and because of one woman who had read it and asked the right question and then been good enough to answer it with a bullet when the time came, all 11 of them were walking out. She thought about Daniel, not about his death, about what he had said in the pre-dawn dark outside the motor pool in Kandahar, when she had been young enough and tired enough to let the frustration show. Become so undeniably necessary that the argument stops being worth having. She wasn't sure the argument had stopped yet. She wasn't sure Reynolds was done building his case for why what she did was something other than what it was. But she thought for the first time that the argument was getting harder to maintain. At the extraction point, Reynolds was already there when she arrived. He was standing to one side away from the rest of the team in the particular physical posture of a man who has made a decision and is waiting to deliver it. She walked up to him, said nothing, let him lead. He looked at her for a moment. The same look as after the convoy complicated processing not yet resolved. But there was something new in it now, a quality she hadn't seen before in his face when he looked at her. He wasn't sure what she was yet, but he was starting to understand that whatever she was, his original answer had been wrong. The fifth position, he said, the RPG. How far was that shot? 814 meters, to the tube, not to the operator. He absorbed this. That's not a standard target. No, sir, it isn't. Another pause. You knew they were going to fire. I calculated a 78% probability. The angle, the target selection, the timing, it was consistent with an intended shot. 78%, he repeated. You fired on 78%. The alternative was a 100% chance of the shot going downrange at your team, sir. Reynolds was quiet. She watched him work it out, the same equation she had presented from a different angle, one that was arriving at the same answer his gut had already given him, and that his logic was only now catching up to. Rodriguez and Alvarez are going to be fine, he said. The wounds are clean. They'll be back on mission in 2 weeks. I'm glad to hear it, sir. They're alive because you moved them. She said nothing. He looked at her, and for the first time since she had walked into the team room 3 weeks ago, the look on his face was not an assessment or a judgment or a calculation of her value against his expectations. It was the beginning of something that, in a different man, in a different moment, might have been called shame. Blake, he said, sir, I need to ask you something and I need you to answer it straight. Yes, sir. That patrol observation, the Marines from 14 months ago, how did you find it? I read everything in the package. Then I read everything adjacent to the package. Then I read the referenced materials from the adjacent documents. That's not standard pre-op preparation. No, sir, it's what I do. He stared at her. Why? She thought about Daniel. She didn't say his name. She never said his name to people who hadn't earned the right to hold it. Because the shot that matters is almost never the one that gets advertised, she said. It's the one nobody saw coming. And the only way to be ready for that one is to see it before it does. Reynolds looked at her for a long time. Then slowly he nodded. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a declaration. It was a nod, the particular minimal, heavy acknowledgement of a man who has moved one step closer to a truth. Truth he hadn't wanted to face. It was enough for now. Sarah picked up her kit and walked toward the extraction vehicle. Behind her, she heard Mendez say quietly to nobody in particular, "Did she just hit an RPG tube at 800 meters?" Sullivan said, "Yeah." A pause. Mendez said, "In the dark." Sullivan said, "Yeah." Neither of them said anything else. The extraction vehicle engine started. The team loaded up. The canyon fell away behind them in the dark, and somewhere in its western wall, 5 cave positions that had been designed to be invisible were now permanently silent. Sarah sat in the rear of the vehicle and thought about distance. Not the 814 meters to the tube, the other kind, the kind Daniel had meant. It was still there, she knew that. But for the first time, she thought she could feel it changing. Not gone, not forgiven, but shifting the way the weight of a thing shifts when you finally understand what it actually is. She looked out into the dark. She had more work to do. The debrief after the canyon operation lasted 4 hours, and for the first 90 minutes of it, Sarah Blake did not say a single word. She sat at the far end of the table, her notebook open, and she listened while Reynolds walked the room through the contact sequence, the intelligence failures, the improvised adjustments, and the outcome. She listened while Mendez gave his account of the left element's movement when she had called the RPG warning. She listened while Rodriguez, his left arm bandaged to the elbow from a fragment wound that he was already pretending didn't hurt, said that the call to move had come with approximately 4 seconds to spare, and that 4 seconds was the difference between a fragment wound and something the chaplain would be handling instead. Rodriguez said it without looking at her, but he said it clearly and in a room where words were chosen with the precision of people who understood that after-action records were permanent. Saying it clearly was the same as saying it on purpose. She wrote it down, not for the record, for herself. Reynolds covered the fifth position last. He described the shot, the range, the target, the result in the same flat, precise language he used for everything. And when he was done, the room was quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something has happened that the available vocabulary doesn't quite fit. Captain Gerald Oakes, the senior officer overseeing the debrief via secure video link from Bagram, said, "Confirm the range on the RPG interdiction shot." Reynolds said 814 meters. Target was the launcher tube, not the operator. A pause on the video link. 814 meters. Tube target. Yes, sir. Another pause. And the shooter is Sergeant Blake. Yes, sir. Oakes was quiet for a moment. Sarah watched his face on the monitor. He was a man in his late 50s, the kind of career officer whose face had been rearranged by decades of things that don't appear in official records. And the expression he wore now was one she had seen before. On certain kinds of experienced men. The expression of someone recalibrating something they had previously considered settled. "Sergeant Blake," Oakes said. She looked up. "Sir." "That's a remarkable engagement under those conditions." She said, "The team's positioning gave me the angle, sir. The shot was available. I took it." Oakes looked at her for a long moment through the monitor. Then he said, "Reynolds, I want a full individual performance assessment on Sergeant Blake on my desk by Friday." "Yes, sir." The link closed. The room stayed quiet for another 3 seconds. Then Mendez exhaled slowly and said to no one in particular, 814 meters, to the tube." Nobody laughed this time. She closed her notebook, stood up, left the room. In the hallway outside, she stopped and put her back against the wall and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, and she let herself feel just for that moment, just in that hallway with nobody watching, the particular weight of a thing that had been carried for a long time finally shifting on its own terms. Not relief, not triumph, something quieter than either of those. A settling. She opened her eyes, pushed off the wall, kept moving. Because there was more work to do. There was always more work to do. And the part of her that Daniel had understood better than anyone else, the part that would never let a success become a stopping point, was already looking forward. Already asking the next question. What had she missed? What had the canyon shown her that she hadn't known going in? What would she do differently? She was back at her bunk and running through the sequence in her head before the rest of the team had filed out of the debrief room. Reynolds watched her go. Then he picked up the after-action packet and sat back down at the table after everyone else had left, and he stayed there for a long time in the empty room. He had a problem. Not a tactical problem. Not an intelligence problem. A personal one, which was the kind he was worst equipped to deal with and had the least patience for. Reynolds had built his career on the ability to assess situations accurately and act on those assessments without hesitation. It was the core competence that everything else in his professional life was built around. And he was sitting in an empty debrief room at a forward operating base in Afghanistan, confronting the undeniable fact that his assessment of Sarah Blake had been wrong from the first day. Not slightly wrong, not underestimating by a margin wrong, categorically wrong. Wrong in the fundamental premise, wrong in the methodology, wrong in the conclusion. He had looked at her and seen a political assignment, a statement, a box someone at a desk had decided needed checking. She was in documented operational fact the reason 11 men had come home from a canyon that had been designed to be their last mission. He sat with that for a long time. Then he opened his notebook and started writing. Not the formal assessment for Oakes, something else. Something he wrote the way he had been trained to write after genuinely significant operational experiences, honestly without the protective layer of institutional language for no audience other than the process of understanding what had actually happened. He wrote for 40 minutes. When he was done, he read what he had written. Then he closed the notebook and did not sleep for most of that night. 3 days passed. The base settled back into its operational rhythm. That particular combination of high-focus preparation and necessary mundane function that characterized a forward deployment. Briefings, equipment, maintenance, physical training, intelligence reviews, the slow reconstruction of a team that had been through a hard contact and needed to be ready for the next one. The next one came sooner than anyone had expected. A signals intelligence intercept processed and assessed within 48 hours of the Canyon operation had identified a Taliban command and coordination meeting that was going to take place in a compound 12 kilometers south of the canyon complex. The meeting was a significant one. The intercept suggested at least 3 mid-level commanders and possibly a senior logistics coordinator who had been on the priority target list for 8 months. The intercept window for the operation was narrow. The meeting was in 31 hours. The planning cycle began immediately. Reynolds ran the initial planning session himself, and the first thing he did before he had even fully outlined the objective was designate Sarah Blake as primary overwatch for the operation. Not secondary overwatch, not a supporting attachment, primary. Mendez heard it and didn't say anything. Sullivan heard it and nodded once slowly, like a man confirming something he had already decided was true. Harris, the PO2 who had used the word lucky in a conversation he had thought Sarah wasn't close enough to hear, heard it and looked at the table in front of him in the particular way of a man revising an inventory. Sarah heard it and wrote it in her notebook without changing her expression. But her pen paused just for a moment before she wrote. One moment, one breath. Then she continued. The planning session ran for 6 hours. Sarah contributed 3 times once to flag an approach route angle that created an elevation disadvantage for the overwatch position, once to identify an alternative position that solved the angle problem at the cost of an additional 400 meters to the primary objective, and once to note that the intercept timing suggested the meeting would most likely be in the compound's interior courtyard based on the time of day and the number of attendees, which had implications for the engagement geometry if direct action became necessary. Each time she spoke, Reynolds listened. Not with the performative attention of a man going through the motions of inclusion, but with the focused, immediate attention of someone extracting operationally relevant information. It was a different kind of listening than the first week. She noticed. Mendez noticed too. He didn't say anything about it. But after the session, when the team was breaking down the planning materials, he walked past her table and said without stopping, without looking at her, "Good call on the approach angle. I was about to suggest the same thing." She looked up at him. He was already past her back turned. She looked back down at her notes. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close to one. But it was something that lived in the same territory as acknowledgement, even if it couldn't say that word out loud yet. She wrote in her notebook, "The distance is changing." Then she went back to the geometry. The operation launched at 02:30 the following morning. 31 hours of planning compressed into movement. And the thing about a compressed planning cycle was that it rewarded exactly the kind of preparation that wasn't visible to anyone else. The deep internalized knowledge of variables that meant when time ran short, you already had the answers and only needed to apply them. Sarah had been running the geometry in her head since the planning session ended. Her position was a natural rock elevation, approximately 600 meters northeast of the compound. At that distance, she had a clear angle on the main entrance, a partial angle on the courtyard. She had been right about the courtyard. The physical layout of the compound confirmed it in a direct line on the 2 secondary structures that intelligence had identified as possible guard positions. She reached her position at 0145 and was set by 0158. 32 minutes before the primary element made its approach. 32 minutes of stillness, of reading the air, of letting the environment tell her everything it was willing to tell. What it told her at 0211 was that the compound was not as quiet as it should have been. "Commander?" She kept her voice at the lowest functional volume and the sound traveling no further than the radio required. "I'm reading movement on the roof of the eastern secondary structure. 1 person, possibly 2. They're not on a pattern. They're watching the approach road." Reynolds already moving with his element toward the compound. "Copy. Can you confirm armed?" "At this distance and light level, I can confirm a long object that is consistent with a rifle. I cannot confirm make or model." "That's a guard position they didn't tell us about." "Yes, sir." A pause, the sound of careful movement in her earpiece. Then, "Can you take the position without alerting the compound if they react?" She had already worked the problem. "If they react to your approach and raise a weapon, yes. If they call out verbally before they raise a weapon, the timing becomes complicated." "Meaning what?" "Meaning I need them to commit to a hostile action before I fire. If they just shout, 'Your entry is compromised,' before I can engage." "Understood. Team is holding at the 400-meter mark. Give me 30 seconds of observation." "Holding." She watched the roof. The shape up there, she had resolved it now. To one person, not two, was moving along the eastern edge of the roof in a pattern that was specifically oriented toward the approach road. Not random movement, surveillance. Someone who knew that the approach road was the threat axis and was watching it with the particular intentionality of a trained guard rather than a curious civilian. The shape stopped moving. It stopped because it had seen something. Commander, the roof position has stopped moving. He's oriented toward your element's position. I assess he has eyes on you. How long before he reacts? Seconds, maybe less. Options. If you move now backward out of his sight line, there's a 15% chance he writes it off as an animal or wind movement. 85% he calls it in. And if we hold, he's going to call it in regardless. He's been watching that road for 7 minutes. He's not going to ignore movement at 400 meters. Reynolds processed this in real time. She could hear the quality of his silence, the specific texture of a commander working through options under time pressure, looking for the third choice that wasn't obvious. He found it. Blake, I'm going to move the team back 50 meters. When he shifts position to follow the movement, you tell me what he does. If he raises the weapon, take him. If he goes to a radio, take him. If he just watches, we wait for him to come down. Copy. She heard the team begin a deliberate, controlled withdrawal. Not a retreat, a withdrawal. Two different things, one of which was a decision and one of which was a reaction. Reynolds was deciding. The shape on the roof turned to follow the sound. She could see the head angle shift, the body weight transfer. He was tracking the movement. His right arm was coming up. He's raising the weapon, she said. Take it. She fired. 608 meters. One shot. The figure on the roof dropped without sound, and the only thing that moved after that was the weapon, which fell and landed on the roof with a noise that was at 600 meters completely inaudible to anyone on the ground. 3 seconds of silence. Roof position is clear, she said. Moving. Reynolds' immediate no hesitation. The team was already back in motion. The compound entry happened fast. The kind of fast that comes from complete preparation and a specific kind of controlled aggression that very good operators develop over years of doing this exact thing in places just like this one. The team hit the main entrance at 0218 and were inside in 40 seconds. Sarah maintained overwatch on the exterior. The courtyard angle she had was partial. She could see the north end through a gap in the compound wall, and what she saw confirmed her assessment from the planning session. There were people in the courtyard, more than the intelligence had suggested, and at least 2 of them were moving toward the sound of the breach. Commander, you have at least 2 personnel moving from the courtyard toward your entry point, coming from the north end. Reynolds, I see them, we're handling it. The radio filled with the sounds of close quarters action, the specific controlled chaos of a trained team working through a compound that was no longer surprised and had started fighting back. She tracked the exterior. Watched the secondary structure to the west. Watched the main gate. At 0224, a vehicle appeared on the approach road from the south. Not a military vehicle, a pickup truck moving fast, no lights. Commander, vehicle on the south approach, no lights, fast approach. I cannot confirm intent, but the timing is not coincidental. Can you stop it? She was already calculating. The vehicle was at approximately 900 meters, moving at what she estimated as 60 kilometers per hour. At that speed and distance, she had a window of about 8 seconds before it reached the compound gate. I can stop it, she said. 1 shot to the engine block. But if it's not hostile, we have a civilian vehicle in a disabled state on the approach road. What's your read? She watched, no lights, high speed, approaching a compound that was currently under SEAL assault at a time when the only people who knew the assault was happening were either in the compound or in her earpiece. Hostile, she said, high confidence. Take it. She led the vehicle by 3 body lengths, aimed for the center of the engine block, and fired. The truck lurched, swerved, and came to a stop 120 meters from the compound gate. 2 men exited running, both armed, both oriented toward the compound. She was already acquiring the first one. 2 shots, 8-second interval. Both men were down before they had covered 40 meters. 2 armed personnel from the disabled vehicle neutralized, she said. South approach is clear. Reynolds didn't respond immediately. She heard the quality of the radio change, the background noise of close quarters action, reducing the frequency of transmissions, slowing. the rhythm of a fight that was ending rather than escalating. At 0231, Reynolds said, "Compound is clear, objective secure. We have two detainees and a significant intelligence package. Casualty count Rodriguez, minor, same arm, same fragment. Wound reopened, he is going to hear about that, otherwise clean. Copy, Overwatch is holding. Hold for 5 minutes, then begin extraction." She held, watched the south approach, watched the roof of the eastern structure where the guard had been, watched the road, watched the compound gate. Nothing moved. The 5 minutes passed in complete silence, and in that silence she went back through the sequence, the vehicle, the calculation, the decision. High confidence. Hostile. Take it. She had been right. The two men who had exited the truck had been armed and oriented toward the compound. Every element of the evidence supported the assessment. But she sat with it anyway. That was the practice. You sat with every decision, even the right ones, because the difference between a right decision and a wrong one was sometimes smaller than the confidence that accompanied it, and the only protection against that gap was to keep examining it. Every time, without exception. She thought about Daniel, and she thought about the marksman who had missed, and she thought about the 18-month-old patrol report in the wrong section of the file, and she thought about the way preparation was not a single act but a continuous one, a practice with no finishing line. She began her extraction. The walk back to the rally point took 22 minutes. When she arrived, the team was already there and the detainees were secured, and the intelligence package was being handled with the careful, methodical attention of people who understood what a document or a device could be worth in the context it had come from. Rodriguez saw her coming and said, "The arm's fine, stop looking at it." She hadn't been looking at it. He knew she hadn't been looking at it. It was his way of saying something else. She accepted it in the spirit it was offered. Mendez was leaning against the extraction vehicle's arms crossed, and when she got close enough, he said, 900 meters, moving vehicle, engine block. She looked at him. Yes. He looked back at her. That's not luck. It was the most important sentence he had said to her since she had arrived. She said, "No, it isn't." He nodded, looked away, looked back. "The first week, the stuff I said." He stopped, started again. "I was out of line." She looked at him for a moment. He was not a man who apologized easily or often. She could see the cost of it in the set of his jaw, the way he was holding his eyes steady on hers, with the particular effort of someone who is making themselves do something their instincts resist. "I know," she said. "That's it. What else do you need me to say?" He processed this. "Nothing, I guess." "Then we're good," she said. She walked past him to find her position in the vehicle. They were not fully good, not yet, not after 3 weeks of what had accumulated between them. But this was the way real repair happened, not in a single conversation, but in the accumulation of moments, each one incrementally smaller than the wound and incrementally larger than nothing. She knew how this worked. She had learned it in Kandahar, when Daniel had been the one who taught her that the only forgiveness worth anything was the kind that came without conditions attached to it. She found her seat, closed her eyes, let the vehicle's movement carry her. Reynolds sat 2 seats forward of her, and he was looking at the intelligence package in the sealed container on his lap, and he was thinking about Friday's assessment report for Captain Oakes. He had been thinking about it since the debrief 3 days ago. He had drafts in his notebook that he had started and abandoned twice, not because he didn't know what to write, but because he was trying to find the language that was accurate without being performative, that said what was true without making it sound like a reversal or a compensation. He knew what was true. He had known it since the canyon, and the compound had made it permanent and undeniable. Sarah Blake was not a political assignment. She was not a statement. She was not a box being checked. She was the best battlefield asset his team had, and she had been that from the first day, and he had spent 3 weeks being unable to see it because he had made his assessment before he had looked at the evidence. That was the thing he could not write in official language, that the failure of assessment had been his, not hers, that she had been exactly what she was from day one, and the delay in recognizing it was the cost of his own bias, dressed up in the vocabulary of professional skepticism. He opened his notebook. He wrote, "The standard I apply to performance must be the same regardless of who is performing. If the standard shifts based on who is in front of me, it is not a standard. It is a preference." He stared at that sentence for a long time. Then he wrote below it, I applied a preference. She exceeded the standard. The record will reflect the standard. He closed the notebook. The vehicle hit a rough section of road, and the whole team absorbed it without reaction, the reflexive physical adaptation of people who had spent enough time in these vehicles that the motion was just background. Sarah opened her eyes for a moment, looked at the dark passing outside, closed them again. Somewhere ahead of them at Bagram, Captain Oakes was going to read a performance assessment on Friday. And somewhere in a filing system that neither she nor Reynolds controlled the accumulated record of 3 weeks was going to be read by people who would make decisions based on it. She didn't think about that. She wasn't built for thinking about that. She thought about this next operation, about the variables she didn't yet know, about the questions she hadn't asked yet because she didn't have enough information to form them, about the geometry of places she hadn't been, and the wind patterns she hadn't measured, and the elevation differentials she hadn't calculated. She thought about being ready, because readiness was the only answer that had ever mattered. Not what people said about you, not what was written about you, not what room you were or weren't invited into. Just readiness, just the next shot, just the distance between the bullet and where it needed to be, and the preparation that closed it. She thought about Daniel, and she thought, I'm still doing the thing you said. I'm making it so undeniable that the argument stops being worth having. I'm not there yet, but I'm getting close. The vehicle drove through the dark, and the team around her was quiet, and somewhere in the secured intelligence package on Reynolds' lap was information about a Taliban command structure that would generate the next operation and the one after that. And Sarah Blake closed her eyes and breathed and let herself rest, because rest was also preparation. And she had learned a long time ago that the only way to be ready for everything was to take care of the instrument that made readiness possible. She rested, and the work waited. It always waited. It always would. Captain Oakes read Reynolds' assessment on Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon he had forwarded it to 3 people above him in the chain of command with a single line of his own attached. Read the engagement data first, then read the assessment, then tell me this assignment was political. Reynolds didn't know about that forwarding. He found out 2 weeks later from a source he wouldn't name, and by then it had already produced consequences that neither he nor Sarah had anticipated. But that came later. What came first was the intelligence package from the compound operation, which the analysts at Bagram worked through over 5 days and produced something that changed the shape of the next 4 weeks entirely. The 2 detainees from the compound had been mid-level coordinators, not commanders. The commanders had left the meeting early, which was either good operational security on their part or luck, and either way meant the primary targets from the intercept were still active. But the device recovered from the compound's interior room contained something more valuable than the commanders themselves. It contained a communications archive that mapped a Taliban command network operating across 4 provinces with a hub structure that the intelligence community had been trying to locate for 14 months. The hub was a compound in the Kunar Valley, 43 kilometers from the FOB, elevated terrain on 3 sides, 1 access road, multiple interior structures, and according to the communications archive, a senior Taliban commander named Rahimi, who had been responsible for coordinating AED networks across a radius that had cost American and coalition forces more than 60 casualties over the past 2 years. Rahimi was a name Reynolds had seen on priority target lists since his second deployment to the region. He had been assessed as extremely difficult to interdict. The specific combination of operational security discipline, geographic positioning, and intelligence compartmentalization that made some targets survive long enough to become almost mythological in the targeting community. The operation to interdict Rahimi was designated as a full SEAL operation. Not an attachment mission, not a support mission. A primary SEAL operation with full planning authority and execution responsibility belonging to Reynolds and his team. The planning cycle was 72 hours. Reynolds called Sarah into the planning session in the first hour. Not as an afterthought. First, she walked in to find the satellite imagery already spread across the table, and Reynolds already standing over it with a red light pointer and a look on his face that she had not seen before, not the controlled skepticism of the first weeks, not the recalibrating expression of the Canyon debrief. Something more focused than either. The look of a man who has committed fully to a course of action and is now entirely concerned with executing it correctly. The target compound, he said, not as a greeting, but as a continuation of a thought he had been having before she walked in. He pointed to the imagery. 3 elevated terrain features on the northeast and west sides, 1 access road from the south. The communications package suggests Rahimi uses the main interior structure as his primary workspace. That puts him in the center of the compound during operational hours. She looked at the imagery, started building the geometry in her head immediately the way she always did, not consciously deciding to just doing it, the way a musician starts hearing rhythm when music plays. "What's the objective?" she asked. "Capture or kill authorization." "Capture preferred, kill authorized." The intelligence value of taking him alive is significant, but the priority is preventing him from continuing to function. She looked at the terrain features. The eastern elevation is the highest. From that position, you have a direct angle on the main structure's entrance and partial coverage of the interior courtyard. The north elevation gives you the access road and the outer perimeter. The west elevation is compromised by the compound's own wall height. You lose the interior angle. Reynolds nodded. "That's what I'm seeing, which means Overwatch needs to be east." "East," she confirmed, "but the eastern elevation has a problem." She put her finger on the imagery. "This ridgeline here between the Overwatch position and the compound, it creates a wind corridor. At operational distances from the eastern elevation, you're looking at crosswind variance that's going to be significant. The thermal differential between the valley floor and the ridge height at night is going to make it worse." He looked at where she was pointing. "How significant?" "At 1,100 meters, which is the minimum workable distance from the eastern elevation, I'm calculating wind variance of up to 12 kilometers per hour lateral, with thermal drift that could add another 4 to 6 centimeters of vertical at that range." Reynolds was quiet. 1,100 meters. That's the minimum clean angle on the main structure entrance, and if Rahimi moves to the courtyard, the distance increases to approximately 1,220. The room was quiet. Sullivan, who was standing to Reynolds' left and had been listening without speaking, said carefully, "That's beyond standard operational range for a single engagement." Sarah looked at the imagery. "Yes." "Can you make that shot?" Reynolds asked. "Direct, no preamble." She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the imagery and she did the calculation, not the quick version, the real one. Wind variance, thermal drift, elevation, differential, target size, movement, probability, time of engagement, light conditions, ammunition, selection. She ran every variable through the framework she had built over 2 years of studying every shot that had ever mattered and why. Then she looked up. "Yes," she said, "but I need 48 hours to prepare specifically for this target environment. I need to run wind analysis on the eastern ridge at operational time, which means I need to be up there for the 2 nights before the operation to build an accurate thermal model. I need ammunition selection review. I want to switch to the Mark 248 match for the longer engagement distance. And I need the full communications architecture so I can coordinate timing with the primary elements approach to avoid the wind window closing before I have target confirmation." Reynolds looked at her for a long moment. "You're asking for a solo advanced position on that ridge for 48 hours. 48 hours of observation data is the difference between a calculated shot and a probability shot. At 1,200 meters, I don't want to be working with probabilities." He processed this. "If the compound detects you on that ridge, the operation is compromised, and you're in an unsupported position 1,100 meters from your nearest friendly element." "I know, sir. I can't get to you in time if something goes wrong." "I know that too, sir." He held her gaze. The room was very quiet. She held his gaze without flinching, without performing confidence she didn't have, and without hiding the confidence she did. She was simply telling him the truth. This was the preparation the shot required, and she was willing to do it, and she had given him the complete picture, so the decision was his to make. He said, "If you're compromised on that ridge, you hold position and wait for extraction. You do not attempt a solo engagement of a compound that size." "Understood." "Understood, sir." "You have your 48 hours. I want radio checks every 6 hours. Miss 1 check, I'm pulling you out." "Yes, sir." She left the planning session and went directly to the armory to begin her ammunition review, and the door had barely closed behind her when Sullivan turned to Reynolds and said, 48 hours alone on a ridge, 1,100 meters from the compound." Reynolds said, "I know." She could have said she needed less time, made it easier for you to say yes. "I know." Sullivan was quiet for a moment. She asked for exactly what she actually needs. Yes, Reynolds said. She did. He turned back to the imagery. Sullivan didn't say anything else. 36 hours later, Sarah was on the eastern ridge in the dark, and the wind was doing exactly what she had predicted it would do. The thermal differential between the valley floor and the ridge height was producing a lateral wind variance that shifted in a pattern she could feel more than measure, a subtle rhythmic push and release that corresponded to the temperature gradient as the valley cooled through the night. She lay in her position and felt it against her face and cataloged it. Not numbers yet, feeling first. The numbers came from the feeling, not the other way around. She had a small anemometer military grade, and she was taking readings at 10-minute intervals and logging them in her notebook, a notebook alongside the thermal readings from the temperature differential between her position and the valley floor. By 0300 of the first night, she had enough data to begin constructing the wind model. By 0500, she had the first draft. By the end of the second night, 41 hours into her advanced position, she had a wind model that was accurate enough to account for the variance within a margin that at 1100 meters translated to a point of impact precision she was willing to stake the operation on. She radioed her last check-in at 0558, 43 minutes before the operation launch. Reynolds Blake status. Overwatch is set. Wind model is complete. I have a confirmed thermal pattern, and I'm ready to engage on your confirmation. 2 things, sir. Go. First, the main structure entrance has had consistent activity between 0200 and 0400 across both nights of my observation. That window closes, and the compound goes quiet until approximately 700. If the operation launches after 400, Rahimi will most likely be in a secondary interior room, not the main structure entrance. That changes my angle significantly. Understood. We're launching at 0315. That puts us at the compound perimeter at approximately 0340. We'll be inside the window. Good. Second thing, I've had eyes on a roving guard pattern that isn't in the intelligence package. 1 person eastern perimeter irregular interval, currently running between 11 and 17 minutes per cycle. Last seen at OHL 551. He's due to appear again between 0602 and 0608. Reynolds, can you confirm armed? AK pattern rifle, confirmed. What's your recommendation? Let him run his pattern. If his cycle brings him to the eastern corner at the time of your approach, I take him before he can call the alert. If his timing misses the approach window, we leave him and deal with him during extraction if necessary. Silence. Then, agreed. Track him and call it in real time. Copy. She watched the eastern perimeter. The guard appeared at 0604, which was 12 minutes after his previous appearance and within the pattern range she had established. He moved along the perimeter with the slightly unfocused quality of someone who had been on rotation for several hours and was running on habit rather than alertness. She tracked him through his full cycle, watched him disappear back to his post position, and logged the time. 12 minutes. The primary element would hit the perimeter at approximately 0340. Based on the guard's current cycle, he would be at the eastern corner, the worst possible position for a covert breach at either 0338 or 0350. 12-minute variance, inside the breach window or just outside it. She relayed this to Reynolds. He said, if he's there at 0338, take him at the moment of breach. If he's at 0350, he'll hear the breach and orient. I'll need you to take him before he can call out. How long do you have between breach sound and his reaction time? At his current alertness level, I'm estimating 4 to 6 seconds from sound to oriented response. That's my window. Yes, sir. Don't miss. She almost said something. Didn't. Copy, Sarah, she said instead. At 0337, the primary element was at the perimeter. The guard was at the eastern corner. He was at the eastern corner because the universe did not arrange itself according to convenient timing, and this was the worst of the 2 scenarios. And Reynolds had known it might be, and she had known it, and they had planned for it anyway. Guard is at the eastern corner, she said. He has not oriented toward your element yet. He's looking north. Breach in 10 seconds. Copy. 10 seconds. She was already on the guard, already inside the breath cycle, already in the space where the world reduced to one specific calculation, and everything else became background. The breach happened at 0338 exactly, and the guard's head turned toward the sound with the reflexive speed of someone whose body had finally woken up even if his attention hadn't, and he brought the rifle up. She fired. 1,112 meters. One shot. The guard went down without a sound, and the team was through the perimeter before his body had finished falling. "Guard neutralized. Breach is clean," she said. "Reynolds moving, not stopping. Copy. We're inside." She stayed on the main structure entrance. The compound was not quiet anymore. There was movement inside, the kind of movement that a nighttime breach produces, the rapid reorganization of people who have heard something unexpected and don't yet know what it means. The interior communications were chaos. She could hear it in the way shadows moved past the interior light sources. She could partially see through the compound structure gaps. Shouting. Movement between buildings. "Commander, I have significant interior movement. At least 4 personnel moving between the main structure and the secondary building. 2 of them appear to be armed security. 2 others, body language is different. They're moving fast but not tactically. Possible HVTs attempting to relocate. Reynolds, we have eyes on them internally. The 2 non-tactical movers, where are they heading?" "Northwest corner of the compound. There's a vehicle there." A beat of silence. Then sharp, "They're going for an escape vehicle. Martinez Cooper, northwest corner, right now." She tracked the 2 figures through her scope as they moved across the compound interior, and she tracked them with the specific kind of attention that was not yet a decision but was ready to become one the moment the geometry required it. One of them she could not engage without risk to the team's interior elements. The angle put friendly forces in the background. She called that immediately. "North mover is in a no-shoot angle. I cannot engage without risk to your interior element." "Copy. We have him." "What about the second?" She tracked. The second figure had split from the first and was angling toward the vehicle from the east side of the compound, clear of the primary element's position, clear of the interior engagement geometry, and moving with the specific purposefulness of someone who knew exactly where they were going and why. "Second mover is clear. He's attempting to reach the vehicle. If he reaches it, can you stop the vehicle without engaging the person?" She ran the calculation in 1 second. The vehicle was stationary, engine not started. The angle was clear. A shot to the engine block would disable it and present no risk to personnel. "Yes, stand by." She shifted the crosshair to the vehicle, found the engine block, made the adjustment for the wind model 1,140 meters lateral drift thermal correction. She fired. The vehicle's engine compartment absorbed the round and produced a sound that was audible even in the compound's chaos. A distinct metallic report that was different from a gunshot and caused the second figure to stop moving instantly. He stood still for 2 seconds looking at the vehicle, understanding what had just happened. That 2 seconds was enough. Martinez came around the northwest corner of the compound and had the second figure in custody before he had finished processing the situation. At 03:47, Reynolds called, "Compound is secure. We have 2 detainees. One of them is Rahimi." She let herself breathe. Just once. Just for a moment. The long, full breath of a person who has been running on calculated stillness for 43 hours and is allowing themselves one moment of being a human being before returning to the work. Then she was back on the scope, watching the perimeter, watching the access road, watching the terrain for any external response to the operation. Nothing came. The compound had been taken clean and fast, and the external response that would eventually come hadn't had time to organize before the primary element was already preparing for extraction with their detainees and their intelligence package. At 0412, Reynolds called the extraction. At 0447, with the team moving toward the extraction point, Reynolds radioed, "Blake, begin your extraction. Rally at Point Kilo." "Copy. Moving." The walk from the eastern ridge to Point Kilo was 40 minutes. She did it alone in the dark on terrain she had spent 2 nights learning, and she did it quickly because 40 minutes of solo movement in territory that was not controlled was 40 minutes of exposure, and she wanted it done. She reached Point Kilo at 0531. Reynolds was already there. So was the full team. So were 2 detainees in flex cuffs, one of whom she recognized from the intelligence package as a mid-level coordinator, and one of whom she did not recognize from the intelligence package at all, but who was being treated with a specific kind of careful, close attention that indicated significance. She looked at Reynolds. He said, "The one you don't recognize, the second mover, the one you stopped with the vehicle shot." She looked at the detainee, then back at Reynolds. He said, "His name isn't in our package because we didn't know he existed. The communications archive we pulled from the compound just now indicates he's a regional commander who has been operating under a cover identity for approximately 3 years. He is, according to the preliminary read, more significant than Rahimi." She absorbed this. "The shot I almost didn't take. The shot that stopped the vehicle, yes." She thought about this for a moment. The geometry of decisions, the way a single calculation disable the vehicle, don't engage the person had in his restraint, produced something more valuable than any engagement would have. She said, "I stopped the vehicle because I couldn't confirm hostile intent in the time to justify a lethal engagement." "I know," Reynolds said. "That's exactly right. The rules of engagement judgment was correct. And the outcome," he stopped. "The outcome is something I'm going to be writing reports about for the next 6 months." She looked at the detainee again, then at the ridge she had just come down from, then at Reynolds. He was looking at her with an expression that was fully resolved now. None of the complexity of the canyon debrief, none of the processing uncertainty of the weeks before it. Just a man looking at another soldier and seeing exactly what was there. He said, "I need you to understand something." She waited. "At the convoy, I told my team you were a political assignment. I said it out loud. I let them hear it because I believed it and because I thought it was relevant information for them to have." He paused. "It wasn't information, it was bias, and I let it circulate as fact, and that has a cost that doesn't disappear when the assessment changes. I owe you that acknowledgement." She looked at him for a long time. What she felt was not the relief of being vindicated or the satisfaction of being right. It was something more complicated, a particular kind of emotion that arrives when something you have been carrying for a long time, it is finally explicitly named by someone other than yourself. It didn't make the weight lighter, but it made it more real. It made it something that had happened and been acknowledged, rather than something that had happened and been asked to disappear into the professional silence of moving forward. She said, "I know you do." He held her gaze. "Is that enough?" She thought about Daniel, about what he had said about forgiveness that has conditions attached to it, about the difference between an apology that asks for something in return and one that doesn't. This one, she decided, didn't ask for anything. "It's a start," she said. He nodded, just once. The same nod from the canyon, heavy, minimal, honest. Then, "Let's get the team home." She fell in with the team for the extraction movement, and for the first time since she had walked into the team room, she was not walking behind them or beside them at a slight remove. She was in the column, in the formation, moving with the same directional intention, the same pace, the same shared understanding of the ground and the threat and the objective. Mendez was directly ahead of her. He didn't say anything, but when she fell in, he adjusted his spacing by exactly the right amount to close the gap between them, and that single physical adjustment, so small that most people wouldn't have noticed it, said everything that his vocabulary wouldn't. She noticed. She kept walking. Behind her, the eastern ridge was dark. At its highest point, the position she had held for 43 hours was already being reclaimed by the terrain, the impression of a person gradually disappearing, the ground returning to its default state, indifferent, impermanent. But the wind model she had built up there in 41 hours of careful, patient observation was not going to disappear. It was in her notebook. Every reading, every variance, every thermal correction. The complete, accurate map of an environment that had tried to be unpredictable and had failed because she had been patient enough to learn its language. She thought about this shot. 1,112 meters. A guard who was already raising his weapon. One round, a breach that went clean because it went undetected. She thought about Daniel. She thought, this is the work. This is the exact thing you meant. Not the moment of the shot. The 41 hours before it. Nobody sees the 41 hours. The shot is what lands in the report. But the 41 hours is what makes the shot possible. She knew something else now too. Something she hadn't fully understood until this operation. The most important shot she had taken tonight was not the 1,100-meter engagement on the guard. It was the vehicle shot. The one she had taken not to kill, but to stop. The one where restraint had been the correct application of force, and restraint had produced something that aggression couldn't have. That was the hardest lesson. Not how to fire, how to understand when not to. Daniel would have said something about that. He would have had a sentence for it that landed better than anything she could construct. He had always been better with words than with calculations, and she had always been better with calculations than with words, and together they had covered each other's gaps. She felt his absence as a presence, the particular ghost of someone who was gone and yet somehow still shaping the decisions you made because you had absorbed them deeply enough that they had become part of your own thinking. She kept walking. The team reached the extraction point. The vehicles were there. The detainees were loaded. The intelligence package was secured. Rodriguez climbed into the vehicle and said to no one in particular, "Same arm, twice. I need better cover selection." Sullivan said, "You need to stop volunteering for the spots with the worst angles." "I don't volunteer. I'm just always in the right place at the wrong time." "That's called bad luck. That's called experience." She sat down across from them and said without looking up from the notebook where she was already writing her post-operation log, "It's called pattern recognition. You keep taking the same position under pressure. Change the pattern." Silence. Then Rodriguez looked at her. Then at Sullivan. Then back at her. "She's right," Sullivan said. "I know she's right," Rodriguez said. He looked at his arm. "Doesn't mean I have to be happy about it." She kept writing, but the corner of her mouth moved, just slightly, not quite a smile, the specific expression of someone who has found in an unexpected corner of a hard deployment something that might eventually become belonging. Not yet, but the direction was right. The vehicles started moving. She wrote in her notebook under the operational log 43 hours of preparation. One clean breach, one vehicle disabled, one unknown HVT captured, 0 friendly fatalities. Then she wrote below the data, "The shot nobody sees is the one that makes everything else possible." She underlined it. Then she turned the page. There was more work to do. There was always more work to do. The debrief for the Rahimi operation lasted 6 hours, and for the first time since Sarah Blake had walked into the team room of SEAL Team 7, she sat at the center of the table. Not the end, not the edge. The center. Nobody made a decision about that. Nobody assigned seats. The team simply filed in and filled the chairs, and when the room settled, she was in the middle of it with Sullivan on her left and Mendez on her right, and Reynolds at the head and Rodriguez across from her with his bandaged arm resting on the table like a badge he'd stopped apologizing for. She noticed where she was sitting about 30 seconds after she sat down. She didn't move. She didn't acknowledge it. But she felt it, the specific quiet weight of a thing that has shifted without anyone declaring that it shifted, which is the only kind of shift that is real and permanent. Reynolds opened the debrief with the operational summary, and he covered every element in sequence: the advanced position, the wind model, the guard cycle, the breach, the interior engagement, the vehicle shot, the capture of Rahimi, and the unidentified regional commander, who was already being processed at Bagram under a designation that would not appear in any document Sarah would ever be cleared to read. When he reached the vehicle shot, he stopped. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "Sergeant Blake made a judgment call under time pressure that I want to specifically address," he said. "The geometry of that engagement authorized a lethal shot on the second mover. Rules of engagement were met. The angle was clear. She had the shot." He paused. "She chose instead to disable the vehicle. Non-lethal intervention. Restraint under conditions that did not require it." Another pause. "That decision produced a capture instead of a kill, and the capture is, as of this morning's preliminary intelligence assessment, the most significant single result of any SEAL operation in this AO in the past 14 months. The room was quiet. Mendez said to no one in particular she chose not to shoot. He said it not as criticism, but as the particular wonder of a man reassembling his understanding of what competence actually looks like. Reynolds said she chose correctly, and I want that distinction in the record because the distinction matters. Knowing when to fire is half the job. Knowing when not to is the other half, and it's the harder half. He moved on to the next element of the debrief. Sarah wrote in her notebook. He said it out loud, in the record, in front of the team. She underlined it. Then she kept listening. 2 days after the debrief, Captain Oakes arrived at the FOB in person. He did not arrive for a routine inspection. He arrived specifically, and everyone on the base understood what a personal visit from a captain at Bagram meant in terms of the significance of whatever he had come to address. The rumor had run through the unit 12 hours before his helicopter landed in the way that rumors run through forward deployed units, not through official channels, but through the specific, informal intelligence network of people who have been in close proximity long enough to read the patterns. Sarah did not participate in the rumor cycle. She was on the Eastern Range running dry fire exercises at paper targets set at graduated distances when Mendez came and found her and said, "Oaks is here. Reynolds wants you in the operations center." She looked at the targets, looked at Mendez. "Now, I am up." 20 minutes ago, he said, "So yes, now." She secured her rifle and walked with him back to the operations center, and she noticed that Mendez walked beside her, not ahead, not behind. Beside, at the same pace, as if they were going to the same place for the same reason. They were. The operations center had the full team in it, which was unusual for a mid-afternoon hour. That wasn't a planning session. Oaks was standing at the front of the room with Reynolds beside him, and the atmosphere in the room had the particular compressed quality of something significant about to happen in a space too small to fully contain it. Oaks looked around the room once. Then he said without preamble, "I'm going to keep this short because operational time is not a thing I enjoy wasting, and I don't think any of you do either." He opened the folder in his hand. The Rahimi operation produced 2 high-value captures, an intelligence package that is currently being worked by 4 separate analytical teams at Bagram, and the identification of a regional command structure that we have been trying to locate for over a year. He looked up. All of that is the result of this team's work, and I want that acknowledged clearly and on the record. He looked at Sarah. "Sergeant Blake." He said her name the way people say a name when they have made a decision about it. "Your individual performance record over the past 4 weeks constitutes one of the most consistently effective battlefield Overwatch contributions I have seen documented in an after-action package in this theater. The convoy engagement, the Canyon operation, the compound interdiction, and the Rahimi operation represent a body of work that is by any objective measure exceptional." The room was absolutely still. "Effective immediately," Oak said. "Sergeant Blake's status on SEAL Team 7 is changed from attached support asset to full operational team member. This change will be reflected in all relevant personnel documents and operational designations. She is no longer an attachment. She is a member of this team." He closed the folder. Reynolds, who had been standing beside Oaks with his arms at his sides and his face in its default controlled expression, said, "Team 7, you have your orders?" Nobody said anything immediately. Then Rodriguez's arm, still bandaged, said in a voice that was working hard not to be as emotional as it was about time. Sullivan said, "Yeah." Mendez said nothing. He was looking at the floor with the expression of a man doing arithmetic that he should have done a month ago, and is arriving at the correct answer in real time. Then he looked up at Sarah and said, "Welcome to the team." 2 words, 4 syllables, the full weight of everything that had not been said in the 3 weeks before them. She looked at him. "Thanks, Mendez." Oaks was already moving toward the door. He stopped next to Sarah and said quietly enough that it was for her rather than the room. "The assessment Reynolds submitted. I forwarded it up the chain with 1 line attached." She waited. "I said read the engagement data first, then read the assessment, then tell me this was political." He paused. "Nobody has tried to tell me that yet." He walked out. The room exhaled. Reynolds came to stand next to her while the team was moving around them, and he reached into his breast pocket and took out a small piece of cloth, a patch the kind that gets sewn onto operational gear about 3 inches by 2 with lettering on it that she couldn't read from the angle he was holding it. He held it out to her. She took it. She looked at it. The lettering said, "Let the bullet speak." She looked up at him. He said, "It's a call sign patch. Unofficial. The team put it together last night." He paused. "I approved it this morning." She looked at the patch again. The words, the particular plain absolute weight of them, where they had come from the things she had said in the briefing room the moment that had seemed like nothing and had turned out to be everything. She said, "Reynolds?" "Yeah. Thank you." He nodded once. The same nod, the one she had learned to read accurately by now. It meant, "I hear you, and I'm not going to make this bigger than it is, and that restraint is its own kind of respect." He walked back to the front of the room. She looked at the patch for another moment. Then she put it in her breast pocket over her heart and went back to work. 3 weeks passed. They were not quiet weeks. The intelligence from the Rahimi operation continued to produce the actionable targets, and SEAL Team 7 was the primary execution element for 4 of the resulting operations, 2 of them in the same canyon network, one in a valley system 40 kilometers west. 1. A vehicle interdiction on a mountain road that required a 1,200-meter engagement from a moving platform that Reynolds had said was theoretically possible, and Sarah had said was practically possible, and which turned out to be in fact possible. Rodriguez stopped taking the worst angle positions under pressure. He didn't announce the change. He just stopped doing it, and when Sullivan noticed and said something, Rodriguez said, "Pattern recognition," and said nothing else. Mendez started asking Sarah questions. Not tactical questions, she had always answered those, and he had always ignored the answers. Different questions. Preparation questions. How do you build a win model from scratch in a new environment? What's the decision process for switching from lethal to non-lethal engagement mid-sequence? How do you handle a shot where 2 of your variables are solid and the third is soft? She answered all of them, directly without the armor she had worn for the first 3 weeks because the armor had served its purpose, and its purpose was done. He listened the way Daniel had listened, not waiting for the end so he could respond. Actually listening, building something from what he heard. She noticed. She let it matter. Reynolds filed 3 separate performance assessments in those 3 weeks, each one more explicit than the last about what he was documenting and why. He was not, she understood, simply writing reports. He was building a record that would outlast this deployment, this theater, this specific moment in a specific war, and would exist in the institutional memory of a military that had a complicated relationship with changing its own assumptions. He was making sure that what had happened here was documented with enough specificity and clarity that it couldn't be summarized away or reclassified into something more comfortable. She knew this because he told her. Directly in the same flat, precise way he told her everything that mattered. He said, "The record I'm building is not just about you. It's about what this kind of performance looks like when the assessment is done correctly, so that the next time someone like you comes through a team like this, the people making the initial assessment have something to compare it to that isn't their own assumptions." She said, "That's a long game." He said, "Yes." She said, "You're playing it anyway." He said, "Somebody has to." She thought about Daniel, about what he had said about becoming undeniable, about the argument that stops being worth having. She thought about how his version of the goal had been individual, make yourself so necessary that they can't ignore you, and how Reynolds was doing something beyond that, something that extended past her specifically into the structural argument about what assessment was supposed to look like. She said, "Daniel would have liked you." Reynolds looked at her. "Who's Daniel?" She had not said his name out loud to anyone in this unit, not once in 4 weeks. It came out now with the ease of something that had been ready to be said for a long time and had simply been waiting for the right moment. She said, "Staff Sergeant Daniel Cole, killed in Kandahar 3 years ago. He was my closest friend. He's the reason I'm here." Reynolds was quiet, not the processing quiet, the listening kind. She said, "He told me to become so undeniably necessary that the argument stops being worth having. I've been trying to do that since the day he died." Reynolds looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Tell me about him." She did. Not everything, not the way you tell a story to someone who has earned all of it, but the outline, who he was, what he was like, what he had said in the early morning outside the motor pool in Kandahar, what the extraction mission had cost, what she had decided to do about it. Reynolds listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "He sounds like someone who understood what the job was actually for." "He did," she said, "better than most." Reynolds nodded. Then he said, "The shot that marksman missed, the one that cost Daniel, I want you to know something. That's not a story that only happened to you. Every commander in a combat theater has a version of it, a moment where preparation wasn't enough and someone paid the price. The difference is what you did with yours." She said, "I trained." "Most people grieve," I said. "You trained. Those aren't mutually exclusive, but you found a way to make one productive in a way that most people don't." She looked at him. "I grieved," she said. "I just did it at the range." He almost smiled. Almost. The very beginning of one at the corner of his mouth before his face resumed its professional set. She filed that away. the almost smile, the closest thing to warmth that Reynolds' face officially permitted. It was enough. The deployment ended 6 weeks later. Not with drama, not with ceremony. The way deployments end gradually, then suddenly, then you're on a transport aircraft and the ground below you is becoming distant, and the FOB that has been your entire world for months is becoming a brown rectangle, and then a dot, and then nothing. Sarah sat in the transport with her kit between her feet and her notebook open on her knee, and she was doing the thing she always did on the way out, running the complete operational log from memory, checking it against the written record, identifying every place where her preparation had been correct, every place where it had been insufficient, every variable she had underestimated, and every one she had handled correctly. The log was long, 4 operations, multiple engagements, 17 individual shots across all 4 operations, 0 misses, 0 friendly fire incidents, 3 captures, 2 of them high value, multiple lives preserved by the combination of overwatch and judgment. She was not proud of it in the way that pride gets performed. She was satisfied with it in the way that a craftsman is satisfied with work that was done the way it was supposed to be done. The satisfaction of a thing completed to the standard it deserved. Sullivan was across from her, asleep within minutes of takeoff, which was the specific talent of soldiers who have learned to sleep when sleeping is available, because the alternative is not sleeping when sleeping is not available. Rodriguez was next to him, also asleep, his arm in a clean bandage. That would be someone else's problem in 24 hours when they got to a proper medical facility. Mendez was awake. He was looking at the notebook in her hands, not reading it. The angle was wrong for that, but aware of it. He said, "You log every shot." "Every shot," she said. "Every one. Going back how far?" "Certification. 2 years of training before that, but those are in a different system." He processed this. "What do you do with the log?" "I use it to build the next preparation," she said. "Every shot that was harder than it should have been tells me something I didn't know before. Every shot that was easier tells me something too." "What does an easy shot tell you?" She thought about it. "That I prepared correctly for the conditions I found, which means I need to find harder conditions to prepare for." He stared at her. "You make it harder on purpose." "The conditions don't ask your permission," she said. "Better to find the edge of your preparation before the operational environment does." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been doing this for 9 years, he said. "I never thought about it that way." "Daniel taught me," she said, "not directly. He would have hated the ballistics work. But the principle you prepare for the worst version of the thing, so the actual version doesn't catch you." She paused. "He taught me that by dying in a situation that was supposed to be easy." Mendez held that. She could see him holding it, not trying to respond to it or fix it, just holding it the way you hold something that deserves to be held for a moment before you set it down. He said, "I'm sorry about your friend." She said, "Thank you." Then she went back to her notebook. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The conversation had gone exactly as far as it needed to go, and both of them understood that, and in that shared understanding was something that looked from the outside like it might eventually become trust. Reynolds was at the front of the aircraft, and he was doing something that she noticed only because she had developed in over 4 months, the particular peripheral attention to Reynolds that came from working closely with someone whose assessments of you matter. He was writing, not in his operational notebook, in a different one, smaller, personal, the kind of notebook that doesn't get filed. She looked away. Whatever he was writing was his. Fort Bragg was cold when they landed. The specific cold of a North Carolina autumn that arrives without apology and reminds you after months of a different kind of cold that home has its own temperature and its own demands. There was a reception, not a parade. Soldiers don't generally get parades from forward deployments, but a reception, the kind that combines official acknowledgement with the necessary human business of transitioning back into a world that has been running without you and needs to incorporate you again. Captain Oakes was there. He had flown back a week earlier and stood at the edge of the reception with the ease of a man who had attended enough of these to know exactly where to stand and what to say and when to say nothing at all. He found Sarah within 10 minutes of her arrival and said, "The unknown regional commander, the one from the compound. His identification is producing results that are going to be relevant for the next 2 years of operations in that AHUO." She said, "The vehicle shot." "The vehicle shot," he confirmed. "The decision not to fire, I need you to understand that that decision specifically has been included in the operational case study that is being developed for SEAL qualification training, not as an anecdote, as a core example of judgment under pressure. She looked at him. A case study. You're going to be a teaching moment, Sergeant Blake, for people who haven't been born into this profession yet. He paused. That's a longer reach than any bullet. She thought about Daniel, about reach, about the distance between one person's decision and the place it eventually lands. She said, good. He nodded once and moved on, because Oakes was a man who said what needed to be said, and then let it do its work without hovering over it. The reception wound down the way they all did, gradually people drifting toward vehicles and families, and the private business of coming back. The team dispersed in ones and twos, the particular dispersal of a unit that has been in each other's company for months and needs the space of ordinary life to remember who they are outside of it. Reynolds found her at the edge of the reception, standing apart from the crowd, in the way she had always stood apart from crowds, not by choice, but by the habit of someone whose primary relationship had always been with the work rather than with the social architecture around it. He stood next to her. They both looked at the range in the distance, where a group of sniper candidates was running a qualification drill in the late afternoon light, their shots carrying faintly across the distance. He said, I have something to tell you. She waited. He said, the case study Oakes mentioned, the judgment call from the compound. I was consulted in the development process. They asked me to provide operational context for the decision sequence. And I told them that the decision came from a shooter who had spent 2 years teaching herself a skill that the institution had declined to teach her because she had decided that the gap between what was available and what was needed was her responsibility to close. He paused. I told them that the judgment in that compound was not a natural talent or a lucky read of a situation. It was the product of the preparation. And the preparation was the product of a choice that was made 3 years ago in Kandahar over a body by someone who decided that grief was not enough and training was. She was very still. He said, I told him his name, Daniel Cole. I said the operation's most significant result was downstream of a decision that Staff Sergeant Cole helped make before he died, and that the record should reflect that. She turned to look at him. For the first time in 4 months of working beside this man, she did not have the calculation running. She was not reading the geometry or assessing the variables or preparing for the next thing. She was just standing in a place where something real had happened and being present in it. She said, you put his name in the case study. In the context section, Reynolds said, Operational Motivation and Preparation Foundation. It will be read by every SEAL sniper candidate who goes through the program for the next however many years. She looked at the range. The candidates were still firing, still missing some, and hitting some still, in the long, difficult, necessary process of becoming what the job required. Daniel's name, in a document, that would be read by people he would never meet, teaching them something that had started with his death and ended with the kind of reach that Oakes had called longer than any bullet. She said he would have made a joke about it. Reynolds said, what kind of joke? She almost smiled. He would have said something like, finally I'm useful at a distance. Reynolds considered this. He sounds like he was good at that. At distance. At finding the right words for things. He was the best, she said, at words. I was better at the math. Between us, we covered everything. She paused. I've been doing it alone for 3 years. Reynolds was quiet for a moment. Then he said, not entirely alone. She looked at him. He said, I used to think you were a statement someone else was making, a political decision wearing a uniform. He held her gaze. I know now that I was looking at it exactly backwards. You weren't someone else's statement. You were your own argument. The most effective kind, the kind that doesn't need words because the evidence does the work. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, you made me work for every inch of it. Yes, he said, I did. And I'm not going to tell you that was intentional or that it was right. It wasn't right. But I will tell you this, the work you did for every inch of it is now documented in enough detail that the next person who comes through a team like this one won't have to start from zero. They'll have a record, and the record will have a standard in it. He looked at the range. I used to think you were just a statement, he said. Now I know you're the standard. She looked at the candidates on the range. Some of them were hitting. Some of them were missing. All of them were in the process, the long, unglamorous, necessary process of becoming the thing the job required. She thought about the convoy in the canyon and the compound and the ridge and the 43 hours of stillness in the dark, in the wind model, in the vehicle shot, in the 2 words Daniel had given her in a pre-dawn moment that had turned out to be the most important preparation of all: become undeniable. She had done that. She had done it 1 shot at a time, 1 hour of preparation at a time, one unwitnessed moment of discipline at a time in the space between what other people believed about her and what she knew was true. And now she was standing at Fort Bragg watching the next generation of snipers learn what the distance between intention and result actually cost. And Daniel's name was in a case study, in the call sign patch in her breast pocket said, "Let the bullet speak," and Reynolds was standing beside her and saying the word standard like it was the most important word in the English language. Because it was. It was the most important word because a statement is made once and forgotten, and a standard is what every person who comes after you is measured against. She was not the exception. She was the proof of what preparation looks like when it is taken seriously. She was the documentation of what happens when someone refuses to let an institution's limitations become their own. She was the answer to an argument that should never have needed answering, and the answer was not a speech or a protest or a political decision made behind a desk somewhere safe. The answer was a bullet, and behind every bullet was 43 hours on a ridge. And behind those hours was 2 years of self-directed study in the margins of a career that didn't want to accommodate it. And behind those 2 years was a morning in Kandahar and a man named Daniel who had understood before she did that the most powerful thing she could do was simply refuse to be less than what she was. On the range, one of the candidates made a shot that was clean and true and landed exactly where it was supposed to land. His spotter called the result, and he racked the bolt and set up for the next one without celebration, because celebration was for later and the work was now. Sarah watched him. Reynolds watched her watch him. And the afternoon light fell across Fort Bragg, and the shots continued, and some of them missed, and some of them found their mark, and the standard, the real one, the undeniable one, the one that had been built not by declaration but by evidence, held. It held because she had made it hold. 1 bullet at a time. And that was the only truth that had ever mattered. And it would still be true long after the arguments about her had been forgotten, because arguments fade and results remain, and she had made results that no amount of doubt could reach. She had let the bullet speak, and the bullet had said everything.